Tom and Jerry in Magical Cat. It was a lovely day at the beginning of spring. The sky was blue, and Jerry was cleaning his mouse hole. But Tom was bored. Tom lay on his armchair and pretended to sleep, keeping one eye open in case Jerry appeared. But there was no sign of the little pest. "Aren't you ever coming out?" said Tom in the end. "Too scared of me, huh?" "I'm just busy," Jerry yelled back. Clouds of dust billowed out of his hole because he was shaking his blankets. So Tom fetched the newspaper and started to read it. Nothing much interesting here, he thought. He turned to the small advertisements at the back and started to work his way through them. Suddenly, he came across an interesting one. "Don't be bored," it said. "Make things happen. Be a star. Become a magic conjurer." And it gave a telephone number to ring. You could order a book full of magic tricks, a magic wand, and a tall black hat. Tom crept out of the sitting room without disturbing Jerry and phoned the number. Jerry stood in his hole and looked at his handiwork. Everything was bright and clean and shiny. He felt rather pleased with himself. "I think I deserve a rest," he said, dusting off his hands. He climbed onto his bed and went to sleep. But not for long. Jerry woke up because his stomach was rumbling. He was hungry, and there was no food in his newly cleaned mouse hole. Jerry thought for a minute. "I know," he said, springing off the bed. "There's a whole cake on the kitchen table." He peered out and saw that the armchair was empty. Tom wasn't there. "Oh, good," thought Jerry, and he scampered into the kitchen. Jerry was soon up the table leg and onto the table. There was the cake where the housekeeper had left it, waiting to be iced. Jerry loved cake, but by the cake was something he loved even more: icing. The icing was all mixed up in a teacup, ready to go on the cake. There was also a wooden rolling pin and a bowl of glacé cherries. Jerry tipped the cup on its side, put his whole head and both arms into it, and began to eat the icing. The cup kept sliding away from him, but Jerry propelled himself along with his feet. He was enjoying the icing so much that he didn't even notice that he and the cup were moving along the table until... crash! The cup pushed the rolling pin over the edge and it hit the floor. Tom heard the crash from the hall. "I'll get you, you rotten little mouse," he cried, dashing through to the kitchen. He glowered up at the kitchen table, about to grab Jerry, but Jerry seized some glacé cherries and hurled them one after another at Tom's nose. "Youch! Youch! Youch!" yelled Tom as the cherries hit him. While Tom rubbed his nose, Jerry leapt off the table and ran for the sitting room. Tom started to chase him and found himself skidding along on top of the rolling pin. Splat! He fell into the sitting room in a heap. "You're too old for skateboards, Tom," jeered Jerry. He jumped onto the sitting room table, sticking his tongue out. Snarled Tom, pulling himself to his feet. He started to run furiously towards the table, then sprang into the air with his arms outstretched to catch Jerry. But, plop! Jerry leapt off the table while Tom was in midair, and blue went Tom as he landed across it and winded himself. "Better speed up, Tom," shouted Jerry as he disappeared into the hall. In the hall, Jerry found a box of golf balls and some golf clubs. These could be useful, he thought. To tipping them onto the floor. When Tom got his breath back, he dashed into the hall and slipped on the golf balls. Unable to get his footing, Tom hurtled nose first into the skirting board. Jerry ran back towards the sitting room, giggling. Tom lay spread-eagled in the hall. He could almost see birds circling round his head. "I've got to do something about that mouse," he thought. Then, ding, ding, the doorbell went. Tom's magical conjuring set had arrived. By the time he had signed for it, Jerry was safely back in his hole. Tom took the set into the sitting room and sat down in the armchair to read the book. There were lots of interesting spells, and he chuckled as he flipped through the pages. An hour later, Tom took his tall black hat and wand into the hall. He wanted to try them out in front of the mirror there. "I wonder what's going on," thought Jerry, who had been watching Tom through his hole. He crept into the sitting room and sneaked onto the armchair. There was Tom's spell book. Jerry carefully turned the pages. He saw that Tom had marked the spells he was interested in with a cross. Jerry read them. He also read a couple of spells that he might find useful himself, and an instruction at the beginning of the book. It said, "Once you start to say a spell, don't break off, or it won't work properly." Jerry was still standing on the chair when Tom came back from the hall and grabbed him. He was wearing his hat and carrying his wand. "Sit on this," said Tom, putting a book on the floor and plonking Jerry on top. "I've been working up a magic act I want to show you." "For my first trick," said Tom importantly, waving a handkerchief, "I shall produce 3 doves from this handkerchief." He put the handkerchief down on the floor and waved the wand over it. "Ickly-zoo, Veruca," he muttered. Jerry remembered the instruction at the beginning of the book. If you broke off in the middle of a spell, it would go wrong. He thought he'd try it out on Tom. "Ickly what?" Jerry asked, looking puzzled. "Ickly... I've forgotten now," said Tom, glaring at Jerry. He rushed over to consult the spellbook. He took it from the armchair and laid it on the floor at his feet. "Ickly-zoo," said Tom. "Like I said." He frowned at Jerry. "Where was I? Oh, yes. Blister, tickly, bum." And the handkerchief bulged. First, it bulged with a pink dove that flew onto the armchair. Then it bulged with a green and red parrot that went to roost on a bookcase. Finally, it bulged with a little owl that blinked a couple of times and flew over to the table.